You know what, say what you want about the US government, but it always does a fantastic job of like taking these decade-old issues and then continuing to do nothing about them. There's this problem that is plaguing hundreds of thousands of Americans today, and the unfortunate thing is it's like a decades-old issue. In fact, to properly explain this and convey just how ridiculous it is, we have to go all the way back to January of 1955.
You are here to participate in an atomic maneuver.
It's the height of the Cold War. Americans are terrified of communism, and there is a genuine fear that the Soviet Union might attack the United States. So for the past several years, the US military has been doing training exercises in Nevada to prepare for that event. And generals imagine themselves using nuclear weapons on American soil to repel a Soviet invasion.
Today, the latest weapons, coupled with the fighting skill of the American soldier, stand ready.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Minutes after the blast, the troops are moving forward toward ground zero to see for themselves the effects of nuclear devices.
Right, I mean, back then, they actually thought that soldiers would just march into the mushroom cloud to finish off, I guess, whatever enemy troops somehow survived that. And although the Soviet invasion obviously never came, the United States detonated bomb after bomb after bomb, conducting over 200 atmospheric tests of nuclear weapons in the Nevada desert and the Marshall Islands between 1946 and 1962. And all the while, the military knew about the dangers of radiation exposure right from the beginning. Not only because the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki died off in the tens of thousands over the years that followed, but also because the US occupation forces there suffered from the exact same ailments, from cancers to sores to rashes and hair falling out. And at the same time, researchers were studying the effects of radiation on American civilians as well, and sometimes without the patient's informed consent, something that was revealed by the Albuquerque Tribune in 1993, with then President Clinton apologizing in 1995 for an experiment conducted in the mid-40s.
Scientists injected plutonium into 18 patients without their knowledge. In another, doctors exposed indigent cancer patients to excessive doses of radiation, a treatment from which it is virtually impossible that they could ever benefit.
But as you just saw in the beginning, they weren't the only unwitting test subjects of the atomic weapons program. Because throughout the entire period between 1946 and 63, as many as 400,000 or 500,000 soldiers and sailors observed the blast from just a few miles away, either on ships or in trenches. And when you remember that the government knew how dangerous the radiation was at the time, the stories are insane. Right, even before reaching the test site, sailors were showered in radioactive rainwater from the previous blast, with them then ordered to decontaminate the decks by scrubbing them with long-handled brushes. And doing all this with little to no protective equipment, basically just regular clothes, and if they were really lucky, some fucking goggles. With one vet even recalling,
"We all had to stand on the main deck and turn our backs and put our hands over our eyes."
And then the blast hit, and they could feel the heat, hear the deafening roar, and see their ship trembling as the shockwave knocked some of them off their feet.
The first bomb, I had my hands over my eyes, they detonated, and I could see all the bones in my hand.
Which, yeah, when you have X-ray vision like Superman, you can safely assume you've received an unsafe dose of radiation. And all of this was part of the US government testing not only the bombs themselves, but the effect they had on equipment and people. Because again, leaders are imagining they're gonna deploy these suckers on the battlefield someday. Though thankfully, Kennedy banned above ground and underwater tests in 1963.
For the first time, an agreement has been reached on bringing the forces of nuclear destruction under international control.
But, I mean, they just went underground instead, with more than 800 tests continuing as late as 1992. And according to the National Association of Atomic Veterans, throughout the whole atomic age, from the first test of Oppenheimer's bomb to the very last, more than 1 million US Armed Forces personnel, civilian scientists, and engineering technicians were involved in the detonation of nuclear and thermonuclear weapons. And, you know, we're not just talking about the people who stood there and watched the bombs go off, right? There's also the crews who came in years later to clean up the mess, once again, without much protective equipment. With Keith Kiefer, who was deployed to the Marshall Islands in 1978, saying,
and they say, "Oh, you don't have anything to worry about. You're not going to get exposed to any more radiation than you would walking around the city of New York or living in Denver, Colorado, or wearing a watch with a radium dial."
He worked 12-hour days, 6 days a week, digging up irradiated soil and drinking heavily irradiated water. And then 6 months later, going home and quickly suffering unexplained symptoms.
Deep muscle pain, bone aches, fevers that would come and go.
And he eventually found out that he was sterile, he had autoimmune diseases, degenerative bone disease, and spinal stenosis. With him saying, by the age of 40, I was told I had the bone structure of a 90-year-old. But he and all the other so-called atomic veterans, they were forbidden from speaking about their involvement in the atomic weapons program. So even when they got ill, they couldn't even tell their doctors they might have been exposed to radiation. And that veil of secrecy, it wasn't lifted until 1996. So by that time, the plight of atomic veterans was already well known for years. So much so that in the late 70s, Congress began debating legislation that would compensate atomic veterans. But it wasn't until 1990 that the Radiation Exposure and Compensation Act, or RECA, was passed, providing lump sum payments of up to $100,000 not only to atomic veterans, but also to two other groups that are often overlooked: uranium miners and downwinders. The first of which is pretty self-explanatory, but the downwinders, they require a little bit of an explanation. Right, they're all the people and the descendants of people who lived downwind from the nuclear test site during that era. And I mean, it's kind of hard to wrap your head around how much radiation they were exposed to over the decades. Right, collectively, all the bombs detonated at the Nevada test site released 12 billion curies of radiation, which makes the 81 million released by Chernobyl look like child's play. And so that nuclear fallout, it got carried by the wind for hundreds of miles, and it coated everything: livestock, crops, soil, clothing, people. And of course, the government did what the government does. The government lied about the radiation. So the people, they didn't know they were in danger. Though at least in the 1950s, they knew there were atomic tests going on. Though the same can't be said for Oppenheimer's Trinity test in New Mexico, where the government claimed that the giant mushroom cloud was just an explosion at a munitions dump. And so according to the documentary First We Bombed New Mexico, there were little girls dancing around in the ash, tasting it on their tongues, thinking it was summer snow. And this happened primarily there, as well as Nevada, Utah, and Arizona, but also it reached as far as Idaho, Oregon, and Washington, with radiation contributing to thousands or possibly tens of thousands of deaths since then, though exact figures are hard to pin down. And many more who didn't die, they suffered from debilitating diseases that they've then passed on to their children and grandchildren, with us seeing future generations reporting birth defects, cancers, immune disorders, and other health problems throughout their lives.
I had cancer. My sisters had cancer, my only sister.
I thought, that's why my brother died of cancer. That's why my mom died of cancer. That's why my sister has a brain tumor.
Bernice has documented more than 4 cases of rare diseases and cancers in her immediate family.
And so since 1990, RECA has dispersed $2.7 billion to around 40,000 atomic vets and others exposed to radiation. Though it is very important to note, it did not cover everybody. Right, to be eligible, you had to live in one of a few states, have a certain disease, and show proof of both. And for whatever reason, the list of eligible states doesn't include New Mexico, where the first Trinity test occurred. But even with that, RECA is arguably less strict than the requirements for VA benefits. Right there, it can be hard to obtain documents proving that you participated in nuclear testing, especially since the vets were sworn to secrecy about it for decades. And then, even when the VA does approve a case, it can take years, by which time the veteran may already be dead or dying. And so the PACT Act, which is usually thought of as the bill for burn pit victims, it also expanded coverage for atomic veterans. But in the year after it was signed, the VA reportedly rejected 86% of radiation-related claims, which is why one advocate says although RECA offers fewer benefits than the VA, it is much easier to navigate and get veterans compensated far quicker. And if a recent bill became law, RECA would have not only been reauthorized, but expanded as well. Because the Democratic-led Senate, they passed multiple bipartisan versions of it last year. But when they reached the GOP-led House, each one got stuck for months because Republicans claimed that it was just too expensive. And that, even though the bill's sponsors said they whittled down the program's projected cost from $143 billion to 50 or 60. And the US already plans to spend $50 billion per year to maintain its nuclear forces this decade. But Speaker Mike Johnson wouldn't even bring RECA up for a vote, so the program expired on June 7th, bringing a nearly 25-year effort to atone for the crimes of America's Cold War to a premature end. Not because the problem's been solved or it's just some distant history. No, atomic veterans are still alive today, and they're as young as 60 and as old as 100. And if you ask them, many say that it feels like the government's just basically waiting for them to die. And also, like some kind of sick joke, the Defense Department recently handed out commemorative service medals to atomic vets, with one telling NBC, "It looks like something you'd win at a carnival," and adding, "I've been fighting this thing for 15 years. There's nothing I can do about it. We were guinea pigs." But then on top of that, even when they do die, this issue's not going away, because they have children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who will continue to suffer the lingering effects of bombs dropped 7 decades ago. And as far as what happens next, is something done? Is it just continually ignored? Thankfully, there still may be a chance to slip RECA into the next defense budget as an amendment and try to get it passed that way. But for that to really have a chance to happen, 1, people need to know about this, and 2, we need public pressure on lawmakers to do the right thing. Which is also why anytime we're talking about a story like this, I'm gonna start doing it today. For the easiest way to contact your congressperson, I'm gonna include links in the description. My dumb ass talking about things, just one part of the equation.